Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode of New Album Spotlight, the show where I put the spotlight on a new album in progressive rock or related genres that I think you'll enjoy if you're fans of the same kind of music as me. If you've been watching my channel, you should have some kind of feeling for what bands I really love, what kind of music speaks to me, what albums stand out from the pack from my personal perspective. And if you've watched my channel at all, you'll know one of my favorite musical artists of all time is Neal Morse and everything he's been involved in. He's my favorite musician by far. I love his songwriting. I love his use of classic progressive rock, but also infusing a lot of modern sounds and technology. And I just think he's one of the best in the business right now, and on par with a lot of the bands from the 70s that we celebrate and talk about constantly. I think him and his various projects are of that same quality level in today's modern prog landscape. And so today's album is the new album by the Neal Morse Band called L.I.F.T, or L.I.F.T, depending on how you want to talk about it. It's an abbreviation. And from the band's own admission, it really doesn't particularly mean anything. They are leaving it open to interpretation, hoping people will kind of fill in the gaps and create their own acronyms and all of that kind of stuff. I think it was actually a product of the band really having a difficult time coming up with a name for this album and going through a lot of different iterations and ideas, and this just kind of being the final landing spot after they were kind of tired of discussing album names and what to do. And it sounds like the album cover was also fraught with a lot of uncertainty and lack of direction. But thankfully, the music itself on this release is of excellent stellar quality, as you'd expect from the Neal Morse Band. They always do things in excellent fashion, and this album is right up to the same level of quality as all the releases that you've come to love and know from the band, from Neal Morse's vast catalog in general. I'm just so pleased that this band is still making music. I was worried that after the departure of Mike Portnoy, not departure, but him going off to rejoin Dream Theater and making that his full-time gig over the last couple years, it left a lot of question marks if he'd be able to do a lot of these collaborative type groups with Neal Morse, and this was probably the big main one that was still a question mark. A lot of his other projects kind of came to a natural end. Actually, Transatlantic basically came to an end after the Absolute Universe tour. They decided that they were just going to call it the end for the band at that point in time. Flying Colors is pretty much on indefinite hiatus because of Steve Morse and his other obligations to family and other projects. And his other projects like Winery Dogs and Sons of Apollo just kind of reached a natural ending point as well. So it seemed like the only band that really didn't have a natural ending and that could still exist in this post-joining Dream Theater world was Neal Morse Band. And I was nervous if this would ever come to fruition, because I'll admit that my favorite current prog band is the Neal Morse Band by far. I think it's just an incredible conglomerate of musicians coming together, some of the best in the business, all creative minds, all multi-talented on various different instruments and different things. They're just one of the best groups on earth right now, in my humble opinion, and have crafted now 5 of some of my favorite modern prog records ever. Favorite prog record, I shouldn't even qualify it as modern prog, but just prog in general. I think they really showcase the best of what progressive rock is all about. Neal Morse has a storied history as an artist. He's been doing prog albums since back in the mid-90s. I consider his career in 3 different eras, perhaps. The first, the Spock Spirit era, that was his first big prog band, which is still exists to this day, but he left the group in like the early 2000s when he had a bit of a spiritual awakening and decided to go off and focus more on his Christian leaning music. And that led into his solo era, where he did albums like Testimony, One, Sola Scriptura, all these kind of cool concept records based around his faith and about what he was feeling and his kind of spiritual awakening at the time, but still never sacrificing the incredible progressive rock musicianship. And that's where his collaboration with Mike Portnoy and Randy George really came to fruition. which leads us to the Neal Morse Band era, where in 2015 he came out with The Grand Experiment, which took the Neal Morse moniker and created a band with it, with the members of the time, Mike Portnoy on drums, Randy George on bass, Eric Gillette on guitars, Bill Hubauer on keyboards, all doing and contributing vocals as well, of course. And that has become kind of the primary project for Neal Morse. Of course, he's always dipping his toes in a million different other side projects, doing stuff under his own name, his more musical-driven stuff like Jesus Christ the Exorcist and the Joseph musicals, stuff with Flying Colors, as I've mentioned, Cosmic Cathedral, and The Resonance are recent projects that he's done as well. But the Neal Morse Band, to me, is like his primary, like, premium quality progressive rock material from the last, 10 years or so. And I've loved every album, and I think there's something truly excellent on display. I think Similitude of a Dream from 2016 is one of the pinnacles of progressive rock. No weak spots. It's just a brilliant concept record based around the Pilgrim's Progress, and he followed that up with The Great Adventure, which continues that story and creates almost this like quadruple album of incredible material all in the same concept. Innocence and Danger was their previous record in 2021, about 5 years ago now, which had a bunch of the shorter tracks on disc 1 and 2 long epics. I preferred the epics side and thought it was some of the strongest material on the epics that the band had crafted in progressive rock. Just really fun, brilliant pieces of music constructed in such an exciting way. And so it's been 5 years since that record, and now we get into L.I.F.T, which is more focused, more of a one-disc effort. They didn't want to do another sprawling double album, I suppose, which they've done the last 3 records. But it still has a lot of material on it. It's still 70 minutes worth of music. And it's following a narrative, another concept record for the band. It seems like they came together. They had a small window to be able to work together between Mike's other commitments. And they got together at Eric's studio this time, which was a little bit of a difference from usually being in Neal's studio. And they didn't bring a lot to the table, it sounds like. Like, there were different pieces and things. The band members tend to come in with little demos and little snippets and musical ideas. But Neal Morse himself kind of mentioned that he didn't really bring a lot to this session in advance, and they were kind of waffling a little bit of what they wanted to do, what music was really speaking to them. And I think it was once they decided it was going to be this narrative concept record that really solidified everything to Neal Morse's mind and made him realize that this is a good structure to put songs together and to create this narrative-driven record. And I think it really works for them. I think this is a framework that the band really excels at in these conceptual pieces. And yeah, you could argue, and I'm sure a lot of his critics will argue, that it's very much the same story that Neal Morse has been telling across many different albums now. It's very much the person going off on a spiritual journey, going through hardships and being able to find redemption and having this big grand, celebratory moment at the end where he comes to find God and find all the answers and be received back into his presence. That's kind of the overall aesthetic and theme that's been in some ways kind of the theme of all of these records up to this point. But it's always accompanied with strong musicianship, with a great sense of emotion and heartfelt sentimentality. And I feel like there's enough nuances and differences here to kind of set it apart from the pack and not just make it feel like kind of a shorter, condensed version of Similitude and The Great Adventure. And I love a good concept record. I'm a big progressive rock fan, so that always speaks to me. And I think it really helps give a good structure to the record, where it has a very strong beginning, middle, and end that takes you through the record. And I love the repeating themes and hearing the music develop as it goes throughout the storyline. I think makes a lot of sense to my ears, and I think it's just the best framework for a Neal Morse album. It works exceptionally well. Beginning starts the record with your typical like instrumental overture. You're going to hear a lot of the themes that will pop up later on the record. I love Randy's prominent bass line that enters the fray before the other instruments kind of build on top of it and play these various themes, both uplifting and some a little bit sinister and darker, kind of telling you that this is going to be a story fraught with different kind of elements throughout the runtime. And then Fully Alive comes out with kind of a more Supertramp style vibe with bouncy piano and trading vocals. Great pre-chorus by Morse before you get this kind of Eric Gillette focused chorus, which is a little bit slower and more deliberately paced, which pays off later when they reprise this in Fully Alive Part 2, and the music's a bit quicker paced and you get a bit more of an uplifting feel, because this is the start of the journey. This is the beginning hopes of what the protagonist is kind of feeling going into the world before things get a little bit darker and he starts to go through a lot of more negative periods in his lifetime. But when it comes back around in Fully Alive Part 2, there's even more joy to behold because he's been through these storms, because he's been through these darker moments that you hear throughout the record. And some of those darker moments you even start to hear in I Still Belong, where he's still trying to hold on to that little shred of hope, but going through some really difficult things. And this is kind of the same sort of smaller introspective piece that you'd hear on like Similitude or Great Adventure, as the protagonist is kind of weighing his own feelings and dealing with some darker things that are starting to be peppered in before it fully emerges in some of these upcoming tracks. Really beautiful. There's acoustic guitar and kind of a darker vocal with moody effects. You get some string sounds and keyboard textures. And then there's a big bombastic moment with real pained emotional vocals from Morse. Gravity's Grip kind of provides a little bit of an instrumental interlude here. A great bouncy prog feel with excellent drum work, triumphant keys, and soaring guitar. And that seems to be kind of their structure here in a lot of ways, as you get these vocal-led kind of melodic pieces that are very song-driven, and then you get these little proggy instrumentals kind of peppered throughout to give you that kind of cool prog sensibility, and make sure you're reminded that this is still a prog band that can play and has great technical chops. But all those interlude, musically fit the feel and themes of the concept of the record that you're going through at that particular time. Hurt People is a great focus on the record. This is an 8-minute track, probably the longest, I believe, beyond the finale, the final track. It's one of the longest tracks of the record, and really a chance for Eric Gillette to shine. His vocals and his guitar work, full of distortion, full of heavy metal crunch. This is one of the heavier pieces that the band has crafted. Very energetic, a sense of darkness and intensity. This is where you're really getting that kind of that angsty feel for the main character about how hurt people. And you get this really expanded proggy instrumental section in the second half that's reprised later in Fully Alive Part 2, but it's one of the best instrumental moments of the record where the band is really allowed to shine and showcase their instrumental prowess. It's a lot of fun. Some sinister organ, some heavy drum fills, some distorted piano, all of these cool things going off in the mix before we get into the Great Withdrawal. Another emotionally driven track. Kind of reminds me once again of like Dark Melody, something like that from The Great Adventure. You get a bluesy edge, you get this killer guitar explosion, great anthemic bridge with vocals from Bill Hubauer before it quiets down to just Neal's vocals. It's a very emotional piece, and I can relate to it. It's the main character kind of withdrawing because of all the dark things that he's dealing with and kind of returning back into himself in a way. And I think that's really expressed well in this song, and leads to Contemplation, another one of those shorter interlude tracks, similar to like the opening of The Doorway by Spock's Beard, or like Seeds of Gold, that kind of classically tinged played piano, leading to the full band coming in, adding to this kind of classical, almost fugue-like instrumental piece, before we get into Shame About My Shame. And I'll admit, this is where I'll talk about my first impressions of the record versus where I'm at now in my experience with it, is that I, at first was, I loved it in first listen, because one of the things I love about Neal Morse and his music is that it's immediately accessible to me. And maybe that's because I'm a fan and I'm predisposed to his style, but I'm immediately drawn into his musical world, and his music really reaches into my brain and grabs hold like almost off the bat, where I can, after just one listen, can really map out the album in my head and feel like I have a great grasp of all the different songs and melodies throughout the record. But there's also hidden depths and hidden layers that you can continually uncover as you continue listening to the album that make it just unravel and become deeper and more meaningful as you uncover all these different little nuances and these different musical pieces that you didn't quite catch upon earlier listens. And so when I first listened to this, I thought, even though I loved it and was already a fan, that it wasn't quite up to snuff of like Similitude of a Dream, Great Adventure, maybe even those epics on Innocence and Danger. I felt like this kind of lacked some of the progginess that I enjoyed from those records, that Similitude just feels like a powerhouse that's just continually moving and going from section to section, and I really love that very high energy, very proggy driven musical landscape, where this one we get to this kind of section here between Shame About My Shame, Reaching, Carry You Again, which feels like it's very much focused more on just really well done, but more mainstream isn't the right word, but more typical structured songs that just sound like typical rock songs, so to speak, and are more in this kind of singer-songwriter-y vein, perhaps, rather than, the typical instrumental proggy fireworks that I tend to like in my music. But I've come to love these pieces of music. They're just so excellently written. I think Neal Morse has such a penchant for great melody and for great songcraft, and these songs have grown more meaningful on repeat listening. And even though the prog factor takes a little bit of a step back through this mid part of the record, there's still so much to love about how these songs are performed and how the emotion kind of leaks through and brings these themes to life. And there's still a little bit of technical, like, fun instrumental stuff in the mix too. Like, don't get me wrong, but I feel like Shame About My Shame is very much that kind of almost gospel-y, kind of bluesy song that Neal likes to come up with, elevated by a great emotion-filled guitar solo from Eric, which maybe has some cues from like a David Gilmour. So that really brings a cool element to the piece, and it's just a really great melody, really great chorus, really great vocal from Neal Morse that elevates this piece. Reaching is more of the big, high-energy rocker on the album. I almost get kind of a King Jesus vibe, or a rock song akin to something like The Who would come up with, not unlike I'm Running from Similitude of a Dream. Great catchy chorus. It begins with this kind of a cappella opening moment before you get into this upbeat, fun rocking section. I love the big bombastic guitar-driven proggy instrumental stuff that happens towards the end before you get kind of a light classical coda with strings and a pleasing guitar and bass kind of interplay. So that you get your little bit of like instrumental moments in the ending part of this, but in the first 5 minutes or so, it's pretty much just this pretty standard high energy but great well-written rock song with a big chorus and just a lot of energetic fun to be had in this track. And then we get to Carry You Again, which once again is a bit more on the kind of Neal Morse balladry side with acoustic guitar and thoughtful lyrics before it gets more anthemic and sing-along. Kind of makes me think of like a U2 style anthem, and almost has a feel of kind of a worship style song from Neal Morse. But fantastically done, just a beautiful sentiment and uplifting and positive and sing along, and reminds me of kind of like a Wind at Your Back kind of moment on the record. And I love this song the more I listen to it. It's just really a well-written piece that signifies this feeling of the protagonist and this uplifting nature of coming into his own in this moment. So we get into Shattered Barricade, which is a short little minute and a half piece, piano melody with guitar over top, very contemplative, thoughtful vocal, before we get into Fully Alive Part 2, which this to me is where we're getting into the like beginnings of this epic conclusion to the record, where Fully Alive reprises the Fully Alive from earlier in the record, and we get some instrumental reprises and more of that like Hurt People kind of darker instrumental interplay, which kind of showcases that we're getting this big kind of uplifting moment. The protagonist is coming to this realization, but there's still some inner workings of darkness that they're still working through in this last stage before the big heavenly ending and everything coming to the fruition of this protagonist coming to this spiritual awakening at the end of the record. And that leads us to Love All Along. Just a gorgeous piece. Neal really nails these like closing tracks on these records. Think back to Broken Sky, Long Day, a reprise section with Eric Gillette like doing that Come On, and the big epic reprisal of the big main themes of the record. On The Great Adventure, you've got The Love That Never Dies, which is the big final conclusion. And goes to those same epic heights. Somehow they're able to repeat this kind of epicness that came before it. And this is in a similar vein. Love All Along just starts very soft and quiet, beautiful ambiance and beautiful keyboards and a vulnerable vocal from Neal Morse. And I think this is very purposeful because it allows this to ramp up to epic heights. When it starts at such a soft, small place, we're able to really ramp it up level by level till it just is earth-shattering and like rising through the rooftops and bringing this all home in this big gospel choir style. Eric has some great bluesy guitar accompaniment through the beginning part of this track. I love that melody of the Love All Along section. It's just so beautifully composed. And the track builds and builds. We get that kind of epic Eric Gillette guitar soloing, a big swelling bridge with choir vocals, and then the typical trick of Eric Gillette re-singing that main melody, but with his, perfect soaring vocal, really belting it out and bringing all the emotion to the forefront. And we get those reprises of earlier themes and just everything coming to a head before kind of a quieter conclusion of Neal Morse singing one of the main themes once again. To kind of bring this home and make this feel personal to the listener as well. That this is about them and their journey as well, and how they can relate what happens to the protagonist in this album to their own experience. And it's a wonderful way to end the record. And it is just a fantastic record by the band. Like, they're masters at their craft. Great songwriting, great instrumental interplay. Every band member shines at different points of the record. It's just the perfect combination of musicians coming together, each giving their input and producing something that's greater than each of its parts. It comes together to create something magical. And Neal Morse Band for me never misses. They're just such a great group of musicians that I cherish and will forever champion. And I'm just grateful that I get to be alive during the time that this music is coming out. And I hope, beyond hope, that they continue forward, make more records, even though Mike Portnoy is busy with Dream Theater stuff. Like, we need more of this music. And I know there's criticisms, and I'm sure many of you in the comments and people outside of that in the music space at large who give a lot of critiques and stuff can nitpick and point things out and talk about the things they don't really care for in Neal Morse's writing, and how he's written a lot of the same material over and over again, how he sounds the same from record to record, how, why doesn't he write about something different? But I love that he writes what he's passionate about, and this is obviously his number one passion, is talking about this spiritual awakening, how we can be brought out of these doldrums and dark parts of life into light if we embrace it. And I think that's a beautiful message, whether you're religious in any way, whether you are Christian or atheist or, come from some other background. I think that's a message that there's some humanness you can take from that, of coming out of darkness and into light in some fashion, whatever that means for you. And it uplifts me. I love feeling positive that I can come out of some of the darker things that I deal with personally and be brought into this light and be able to experience joy and happiness in my own way. I think it's a beautiful message, and I always want Neal to sing about what he's most passionate about. I think that's what creates the best art, is people truly delivering what they're passionate about, regardless of what the world is trying to tell them, what they should be passionate about, or what they should write about, or what they should do with their art. I think Neal's an artist with full integrity, and I really respect him. And I'm just grateful for the wealth of material he's provided me over my whole existence of really enjoying and listening to progressive rock. It's been incredible, and this is another, incredible release from the band that I will cherish forever. It just brings me so much joy. I loved Cosmic Cathedral, I loved, Neal Morse and the Resonance. Some of his other projects allow him fun outlets to do other things and to explore different sides of his musical landscape. But to me, this is the real meat of what he does. This is where he creates his masterpieces with like-minded people who bring a lot to the table and have crafted something truly brilliant that I will cherish forever for the rest of my life. So thank you guys for joining me. Hopefully you appreciated this review. I know it's a little bit lengthy, but when I talk about Neal Morse, I tend to get a little bit carried away and do some lengthier reviews. But hopefully you appreciate what I had to say, and are open-minded and are able to appreciate and enjoy this music. And let me know your thoughts if you've heard it, or once you do hear it, or if you have excitement for it. I'd love to hear about all of that stuff in the comment section. Thank you guys for all of your support, and I'll hopefully catch you in a future episode. Bye everybody, enjoy the music.